I just want to take a second and just welcome everybody that's tuning in online, our Global X fam. Can you all help me just show some love? Every week we have part of our church through this pandemic that is just connecting online with us, and we're excited whether you're in the room or you're watching this online that you would join with us. And I don't know about you, but man, this has been a really interesting week, hasn't it? Wow, I'll tell you what, I've lived through a lot of elections and I've never quite lived through something like this. I don't even know how you feel about it today. I don't know if you're depressed or if you're excited, or I don't know if you're still unsure, if you're holding hope that maybe some lawsuit might turn something around. I don't know how we all feel about it today, but I think we could all at least kind of just recognize that this is a very significant cultural moment. It's a very important time in the life cycle of American politics, regardless of how we feel about it, how you feel about the outcome. I know that a lot of people feel like they're either depressed or they're excited, and we're all over when it comes to our emotions. And as a church, here's the thing you're going to find about our church. We just like to step right into that kind of tension. We want to step into, some of you just want to ask, like, why are we talking about all of this stuff surrounding all the politics? Some of you probably go, I come to church to get away from it. I understand that. And so here's the good news for you. This is the last week of this series, but I also, don't get too excited. My gosh, that just hurt my feelings. I feel like we're all thinking about it. We're all immersed in it. Let's see if we can actually discover God's perspective in it. That's, I think, a more important matter in all of this. Not how is the cultural flow of this, but what is God's thought for us in this moment. In this series, Citizen, is we've been kind of just talking about, as a citizen of the United States, if you are one, great. If you're not, that's awesome. Wherever you were born, you didn't get to choose that, right? We're trying to kind of like walk through this and say, what is our response? Not just as maybe a citizen of this country, but what's our response as a Jesus follower? What does it look like for our community? I've been saying it as a Christ-centered community to respond in such a tense and kind of volatile way in our culture, like where we feel and we see the clash of sides and the division in our country. What does it look like for the church of Jesus to kind of rise above all of that? Amen? I want us to rise above all of that in this season. And so here's what we've discovered. If you haven't joined us on this journey and you're brand new, I'll just kind of quickly bring you up to the concept of citizen. Though I am an American citizen and I recognize that, I also know that as a Jesus follower that I am a citizen of heaven. I'm a citizen in the kingdom, which means I got one foot in America and I got another foot in the kingdom of God, right? And so one of the things we discover is that my citizenship in heaven is greater than my citizenship here on earth, because I'm only going to live on this earth for maybe 60, 70, 80, 90 years old. I don't know, but I'm going to spend eternity in the kingdom of God. And so I got to immediately recognize that. Why is that so important? Because it begins to shape my values on earth. If we believe that Jesus came to earth to bring heaven to us, and then he deposits that into his followers, then the whole idea is, if you're a Jesus person, is that we are to live our lives so that we bring heaven to earth. Not so that we just act like everyone on the earth, but that we might be in the world, but this is why the Bible says, but not of it. Because I have a different viewpoint. And so one of the things that we learned last week is we know what matters most in our country, freedom. But what we learned last week is the highest value in God's kingdom is actually what? You remember? Love. One person. Praise God. I did a great job last week. Love. Our love is greater than our differences. And that should be the posture of our hearts. Now today, as we close up this series, we're going to close it. I just wanted to step into this tense moment, and I'm believing in God, let's just move forward. That's what I'm believing for, okay? So that's, after this weekend, I'm ready to move forward. And I want to deal with a concept that is really hard for us as Americans to get, but something that I believe flows straight out of heaven. Something that God, I think, is so important, and I feel like this is the right time to talk about it, but there's a concept that flows right out of heaven, straight from God, that I feel like we need to talk about because it's a kingdom concept that we struggle with sometimes here in America, and that is this word authority. Everybody say authority. Authority. I know this, that most of us struggle with authority. I know, let's just be honest. Like, my wife might be one of the only few that I know that, like, whatever the rules are, that's the rules. You don't break the rules. Can we bend the rules just a little bit? I try not to break them if they're real serious, but I think most of us struggle with the idea of authority. We like authority when we're in the seat of authority. We don't like authority when we're under somebody's authority that we don't like. But I want to talk about this concept. I want to talk about this construct because I believe it actually flows from heaven. Now, here's the real struggle, okay? That growing up as an American in the United States, and I am a citizen of the United States of America, growing up in an environment where it is a democracy or we are a democratic republic. I don't know if you know the difference between them, but it's kind of similar. Democracy is where the people choose. The people decide everything by vote. A democratic republic is where the people decide who to put into office to represent us, okay? But I want you to understand something. Think about this. When it comes to living in a democracy, and I think a democracy is one of the greatest forms of government that you can have. I think it's so beautiful in the way it works. I think it's awesome, okay, for government. But here's the thing, when you think about our government in America, and think about our preamble to our Constitution, we the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, we the people, can I ask you a question? In a democracy, who holds the authority? It's the people, right? The people do. You say, no, the government's in charge. Well, here's the beautiful thing about a democracy or a democratic republic, right? Is that if we don't like the way somebody that we've put into office is making policy and doing things, we can vote them out. That means we hold the authority in a democracy. That's what we love. That's what we've grown up with. Most of us, we've grown up with a mindset that we're in control. That's great. But can I tell you something? In a kingdom, it's different. In a monarchy, we're not a monarchy in America. There are monarchies on this land. But in a monarchy, the people don't hold the authority. The king or queen or the ruling family has the authority. You understand what I'm saying? There's a difference. Now, here's what I want you to see, because here's a tension that you're going to live with if you're a Jesus follower. I got one foot in a democracy. I got another foot in a kingdom. In one sense, I'm told we have all the authority. In another sense, I'm told God has all the authority. So you need to recognize something. There's a tension in that. And as Americans, when I think about America, think about this. Our whole country, everything that we have that was founded, it was founded on resistance to authority. We are a country independent from Great Britain, if you know your history, because we had people who rebelled against authority. So our country was formed out of rebellion. I want you to consider that for just a second. Resistance. We want to be free. And so in that mindset, we see ourselves as, I have the authority. But if you're going to step into the kingdom of God, you're going to have to recognize something. God holds all the authority, not me. This is why this is so important. I felt like we need to dive into this, because I feel like this is a concept or construct that we're not real clear on. And why do I feel that way? It's because what I have seen in our culture, our society, all my life, but even more so ramped up in the last several years, is that there is an ongoing lack of respect for authority. Would you agree? There is a simple lack of respect for authority. We see it all the time. You go hang out in schools, and some of you are teachers, principals. You'll see it. There's students that will not respect the teachers. There's kids that don't respect their parents. Hello, parents. You know, you deal with them all the time. There are adults that will not respect their bosses. There's a country, groups of people that don't respect their leaders, their government leaders, their president, their governors, their leaders. There is a lack of respect today in our culture. And I think the thought is this, that if we don't like you, we will not respect you, and we will not submit to you. And you know what bothers me? I get that in our culture. But if I could just be honest, what I don't love is what I've seen come from people who claim to follow Jesus. I have seen more hatred and more disrespect for leaders and people who are in a position of authority than I could have ever imagined. And I'm thinking to myself, that's the way our culture responds, but that's not the way it goes in the kingdom. So can we just talk about authority a little bit today? This is my pressing on some things you don't love, but can I just tell you something? That's how we grow. If you showed up at church and I just told you everything you always know and everything that made you feel better, you would never grow and change as a person. And so I feel like we need to lean into this. So here's what I want you to do. If you got a Bible with you, I would love for you to turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. You're going to get your Bible or electronic device. Now, we're going to get there soon. So I'm going to give you one of those. We're going to take a little bit of a detour. But we're going to end up in 1 Peter chapter 2. But I want to talk about what this looks like for us. In 1 Peter chapter 2, we'll get there. But first, we need to take a detour to Romans chapter 13. Okay, I'm going to read you just a couple verses from Romans chapter 13 that's going to really help us begin to understand authority from God's vantage point. Romans 13 is a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Rome. And Paul had something. He was an apostle. He was a follower of Jesus. And he said something interesting in Romans 13, verse 1 and 2. He said, everyone must submit to governing authorities, if you like them. Oh, wait, no, that's a little footnote. He said this, for what? Everybody say these next two words with me. For all authority. Okay, you did not do that very well. Why? Because there's something inside of all of us that wants to resist. Let's try it again. I want everybody to say it through your mask. Ready? For all authority. See, I know we don't believe that yet, but we will by the time we're done. For all authority comes from, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by, so anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. Paul wants the church, and I think if he were here today, maybe if he could deliver this message, he'd do a better job than I could. But Paul wants us to understand that all authority comes from God. It's from above. You see, most of us don't view authority like that. Most of us don't view authority from a top-down approach. We view it from a bottom-up. Let me tell you what I mean. If you were to say, well, where does authority come from? Most of us might think, well, it's whoever rose to power. Whoever became the strongest. Like, I'm just trying to think early ancient humans, however you believe they got here. At some point, someone had to rise to power. Was it might makes right? Was it survive? I don't know, but we think about what started first is whoever became the strongest, and then the tribe that became the biggest, or the nation that became the strongest in our history. That's where authority comes from. But no, Paul says, actually, you need to understand something. Authority originated from God. In fact, if I could just show you this one verse, I want to show you another verse. You don't have to turn there. But when God was creating mankind, in the very first chapter of the first book of the Bible, we find this narrative. In Genesis 1:26, I want you to hear what God says as he's going to make mankind. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule. I want you to see that from the very beginning, something's connected to our very beginning, our creation, is this idea of authority. God has it, God creates, and God says, I'm going to create mankind so they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. From the very beginning, we see this idea that authority comes from God. Well, what about the people that get into a place of authority that I don't like? Well, Paul didn't give us a footnote for that. He just said that all authority comes from heaven. That all authority originates in heaven, and anything you see, whether it's parents, that's authority, whether it's local leaders, whether it's national leaders, whether it's world leaders, that concept of authority began with God and is so important to God that, listen, here's what Paul said, that if we resist and if we rebel against authority, we need to understand something. We're rebelling against something God created. Now, let me put this in just like vernacular we would kind of really grasp, so like an idea we can understand. Let's just say you go to work one day and your supervisor says that we're making a change. Your supervisor says, you know what? We got to change some things. So I know you know how to do your job, but there's a new process that we're putting in place that I'm going to need you to do all of these other steps to complete your work. And you go back to your desk and you know immediately, it's like, oh my gosh, this is going to make my life so miserable. Do you realize how much more paperwork I'm going to have to do? This is going to be awful. And so you look at that and you know better than everybody else. And so you think to yourself, that's stupid. I'm not going to do it because I know that I can do my job way better than they think that I can do my job. And so I just am not going to do it. What you may not realize is that policy didn't just get handed down from your supervisor, but came from the CEO. And the reason why the CEO instituted a new policy for everybody in the company was because the government changed the laws of the land, and if you don't actually do those steps, you're actually violating laws of the land to which you can be penalized as an organization. So let me ask you this question, because I know you know better. When you refuse to do what your supervisor asks you to do, you need to recognize you're not just rebelling against that supervisor, but every single level of authority above that supervisor. Do you understand what I'm saying? What I'm trying to help us see is what Paul is saying, is that all authority, even those in positions over us, everybody, here's what he said, it flows from God. And to resist, you're actually resisting against something that God created and established. Now, most of us, I will say this, are good with authority as long as we agree with it. Right? Most of us are okay with authority as long as they're nice. Most of us are good with our bosses or our bosses' bosses. Most of us are good with the teachers, the principal, as long as they're nice. What happens when you have an overbearing, rude, demeaning, or I'll go even further, evil leader? What happens if you're sitting underneath someone that has no business being over, is maybe one of the worst, and some of you immediately, you might start thinking about your own life. You're thinking about, oh, my boss, or my boss's boss, or this person in my life, and you're immediately thinking they have no business in that. What should I respond? How should I respond in those situations? Because what I see in our culture today is that we have lost any sense of real authority. That we resist authority, and it's a badge of honor today. It really is in our culture. But what is our response? That's what I wanted to ask. As a Jesus follower, right? I only have one response to this moment. I don't care if you're upset about who got elected. I don't care if you're resisting because you think, well, wait, no, there's something fishy going on. Or I don't care if you're excited about, listen, what I'm saying is in this moment, in every moment like this, there should only be one response if you're a Jesus follower. By the way, let me just say this. If you're happy right now with who got elected, that's great. But recognize that in 4 years from now, you might not be. So this applies to all of us. What's my response? Okay? I want to show you something. We're at 1 Peter 2 now. I believe that this passage that I want to read to you, just a few verses, is the perfect summary to this entire series and this conversation. What is my response? 1 Peter chapter 2, I want to read verses 13 through 17. Here's what Peter, now Peter, this is not Paul, this is another guy who had walked with Jesus his entire ministry. Some would say maybe no closer to Jesus than Peter. Here's what Peter said to the church, and most believe he was writing to the church in Rome at the time. He said, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to whom? Can you all say that out loud and you can just look at the screens? To every human authority. That sounds so much like what Paul said. He said, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will, this is important, that by doing good, you will do what? Notice this, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. And verse 17, show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. I know this sounds so similar to what Paul said. Peter leans into the church in Rome and he says, submit to all authority, every human authority, even to the emperor. Now, I need to now paint a picture for you. I read the passage first, but I need to give you the context. Because it's one thing for us to hear it today. It's another thing for the early Christians to hear this from Peter. I need to paint this picture, okay? See, at the time, the nation of Israel and even these Christians were living in a land that was dominated by the Roman Empire, okay? They were in control of the whole known, really most of the whole known world at this time, all right? The Roman Empire. And at this time, there was a Roman emperor who was in control, and his name was, I don't want to screw it up, but it's Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. That's easy for you to say, right? Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. This is the guy who was the emperor when Paul was right. Because Paul said, right, honor all authority, including the emperor. Okay? Now, some of you go, I've never heard of this guy. It's because if you were born with a name like that, and then you became the emperor, the first thing you would do is change your name. So he changed his name. You may recognize this. I'll put up the short version, but his new name was actually Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Now that's a much greater name, isn't it? But maybe you did recognize something. He was an emperor. He's the 5th emperor of the Roman Empire. This was Emperor Nero. How many have ever heard of Emperor Nero? Raise your hand if you have. See, if I said how many of you have heard of Emperor Lucius, no one would have raised their hands. Now, Nero was the emperor at the time when Peter wrote this. And he actually ruled in the Roman Empire from about 54 to 68 AD, okay? That is his time. Like, I'm not really sure if that's what he looked like because they don't have any great pictures back then, but for some reason, that's what Google thinks that Nero looked like. But he ruled from 54 to 68 AD. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Nero, okay? Nero actually rose to power when he was 17 years old. 17 years old, can you imagine? You're told you are the emperor of this massive Roman Empire, the same Roman Empire that put Jesus to death. By the way, Nero was born just a few years after Jesus was crucified and then raised again. And so in 54 AD, at 17 years of age, Nero becomes the emperor. Now he was young, he's a teenager, he still has pimples, and so his mom actually did most of the ruling of Rome through him. His mom was kind of the person who was like calling all the shots through Nero. Now this went on for 5 years, but how many of you know that there's a time when you grow up and you say, Mom, stop, I'm a man, I can do this. And so 5 years, he allowed his mom to kind of just like call all the shots, and he finally got tired of it, and he got tired of her, so he had her assassinated. This is a nice guy, right? This is Nero. Something interesting happened on July 18th of 64 AD. July 18th, 64 AD, a massive fire broke out in Rome, okay? This fire was so awful and so widespread that it burned for about a week straight, destroying many of the provinces in Rome. Massive fire. And immediately what all the historians say is that most of the people, or at least the people around at that time, all thought Nero started it. The ruler of the Roman Empire started this fire that killed many people, destroyed. Some historians say that they think that Nero burned down a portion of Rome because he didn't like the old construction and he wanted space to build his own stuff. Now, Nero, as he started feeling the pressure of everybody who thinks, here's this guy who would burn down parts of our city, here's what Nero did. Nero decided he wanted to get the pressure off of him. So what he did was, he found a small group of people who weren't powerful at all, that sometimes he had heard kind of pledge their allegiance to some other king, but not to the Roman emperor. I'm talking about Christians, and started a wave of persecution against the Christians. This happened, okay? And immediately, he began to arrest Christians all in the Roman Empire. And even if they didn't have a reason to persecute and kill them, he would blame them for arson. This is what happened, okay? So can I just tell you what he did? I mean, this is how awful it was. They would take animals that they killed and skinned, and they would take the skins of freshly killed animals and wrap them and tie them to Christians, while wild animals would attack them and destroy them and eat them and tear them apart. This is Nero, the emperor. They would take other Christians, and what the Romans were famous for is one of the greatest forms of persecution and death there was crucifixion. That wasn't just a single thing for Jesus and two other guys. And so they would take and they would hang Christians up on these crosses to make a statement, okay? And they would hang them there all day long, and then at nighttime, as it would get dark, they would light the crosses on fire as torches. Now, I have your attention. Peter writes to the Christians, these early Christians who were right in the middle of this massive persecution. And he says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, even the emperor as the supreme authority. I want you just to feel that for a moment. See, most of us today, we want to reject authority if it somehow impedes my freedoms. I mean, I just think about this year. And I think about some of the things that we as in the church have cried about. How the government is persecuting us during a pandemic because they asked everybody to shut down. I just think about that for a moment. Now, you might still feel that way. But if I could just say something, don't ever get to heaven or wherever that looks like and talk with Peter about how awful it was, how they made us wear masks. It said we couldn't hang out close to each other for a year. That is not going to fly well when there are Christians who were encouraged by Peter to submit to the authority of an emperor who is wicked and evil. You see, context matters. I need us to understand, because sometimes what I think we do as Christians in the 21st century is that we hear Bible verses and we only think of them in our context. And then we go, oh, I can't do that. I can't, there's no way. You don't know my boss. You don't know my principal. You don't know them. You don't know my dad. And Paul and Peter and all these guys that lost their lives for the sake of the Lord responded to authority in this way. Why? Man, it just blows my mind. Why? Because they understood something. Authority comes from God. And if I am going to honor God, I have to honor authority, whether I like them or not. And I want verse 17, I'm going to read it again, because I feel like this should be the summary of this series. If there's anything I would hope that you would take away from this series, in this moment, it's this verse. 1 Peter 2, verse 17. Let me read it again. He said, show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God and honor the emperor. What if that was our marching orders as a church in this time? That we're first to show proper respect to everyone. Can I say it again? Let's show proper respect to everyone. Let's show proper respect to everyone. People that don't vote like I did. People that are in a different class than I'm in. People in a different race that I'm in. People are in a different, listen, show proper respect. What does it mean to show proper respect to everyone? Here's what it means. Every single person has the highest value you can imagine because they're made in the image of God. And because they're made in the image of God, they matter to God. They're going to matter to me, and I'm going to show respect. We might disagree, but my gosh, I hope I can do it with great respect. I hope this is convicting, to be honest with you. I hope some of us right now are thinking about things we've said online, things we've said to people at work, that was so disrespectful that maybe today we're going to go back and we're going to remove our comments. Because I want to honor God, so I'm going to need to show respect to every person, recognizing they all come from God and they all matter to Him. Show respect to everyone. Second thing, love the church family. He said, love the believers, love the family of believers. Now listen, we're to respect everyone, but here's what's unique about the church is we're a family. And here's the beautiful thing about love. Love goes beyond just showing respect. Love means that if you offend me, I still will love you. If you hurt me, I'll forgive you. Love covers a multitude of offenses. Love says that I am with you thick and thin. Love says that even when it gets hard and even if we don't feel the same way politically, we don't feel the same, I will love you deeply enough that I'm going to serve you and I'm going to give for you and I'm going to do whatever it takes so that you know that you're loved by God and you're loved by me. That's what we should be doing, especially in the church. We're going to show proper respect. We're going to love the church family. We're going to fear God. Now, here's what fear God, because some of us hear that and we go, oh my gosh, you mean be afraid of God? That's not what he means. He doesn't mean be afraid of God. He means, what does it look like for us to live as though we still believe that God is with us right now? Would you do the things that you do? Would you say the things that you say? Would you treat people the way you treat people if you knew that God was standing right next to you? To have a healthy fear of God means that I'm going to love you, I'm going to respect you, and I'm going to treat you with kindness. That's what it means to fear of God. There's a well-known, maybe some of you a little bit older will know this name, televangelist that had a massive fall, and rightfully so. His name was Jim Bakker. I don't know if you remember Jim Bakker. And he had this ministry, and he had moral failures and illegal activity that landed him in jail. One time, he was asked by someone after his fall, and he'd lost everything. He was asked, when did you fall out of love with Jesus? And he said, I never fell out of love with Jesus. I fell out of fear of him. If we knew that Jesus was really with us when we're at work, when we're alone on our mobile devices, would we still say the things that we say? See, I want to live like God's with me. And so I want to fear God. And then the last thing he said was this: honor the emperor. Who's he talking about? He was talking about Nero in that day. Honor, respect a king, a leader who is wicked, who does awful things, atrocities that are so ungodly. I'm supposed to honor that guy? He's not honorable. And Peter would have said, it doesn't matter. Honor the emperor. Honor the emperor. How in the world can I honor? Here's what you should see. Honor the position even if the person isn't honorable. Do you hear me today? I feel like we need to hear this. Honor the position even if the person isn't honorable. Respect the position even if the person isn't respectable. Respect the seat. Respect the position that God has established, even if they are the worst leader you could ever imagine. That's what we're called to do, guys. Listen, no matter how you feel about this election, and I promise you we'd be split in who we wish to be in charge right now. It does not matter. If you're feeling the burden and the weight of this election, can I just encourage you, let it go. Because God is over all authority, and God establishes authority. And anybody that ends up in that seat, God says, I'm still in control. The most important thing for our church right now, the most important thing for us as Christ followers right now, listen to me, is that in this process here in America, is that we honor and respect the leader. I don't care if you didn't vote for him. We honor and respect the leader. And you know what we're also called to do? Pray for our leaders. You know what kind of rhetoric I've heard come out of our culture for the last 4 years, and it even goes back further than that? When people felt like, well, that's not I heard this phrase, he's not my president. If you're a citizen of the United States, whoever is the president is your president. And to say a statement like that, you are rebelling against God. I don't care who's in the office. I don't care if it was Barack Obama, Donald Trump, or Joe Biden, or whoever it might be. They're my president. And you know what? For at least the next 4 years, I'm going to honor that authority is placed over me. And I'm going to pray for, I prayed for Barack Obama. I prayed for Donald Trump. I'm going to pray for Joe Biden. I'll pray for him. If you go, I'm not going to pray for him, then you ought to check your heart. I'm just going to say it. If you don't like it, I'm sorry. Go read the Bible. This is what we're called to do. And I know some of you, you're thinking, but I feel like this leader could be bad for our country one way or the other. You felt like our past one was. You feel like the next one could be. I don't see how we can say that God, all authority, every human authority. I was struggling, I'll be honest with you. I was struggling a little bit as I was dissecting for myself this idea of authority. This past week, I was thinking back to all these different leaders in human history. And I immediately thought about some of the worst. I'm thinking about Stalin, Hitler, Mao. We're talking about some guys that forcefully took power and then ended up executing millions and millions of people. That's just in the 20th century. I was like really wrestling. God, how can we see that you're behind authority, and how can I respect authority that's even evil authority? And I was preparing, and I came across this study. And God showed me something through this article that was written. It was an article I found from 24/7 Wall Street that someone did recently, real recent, where they ranked the top 50 most powerful leaders of human history that we know. Now, I'm going through this, counting down, there's slides, and you're scanning through them all. And there's very few U.S. presidents, by the way, very few. It's like one or two, and they're not even anybody you'd think of. And I'm scrolling through, and as I get through, I get to number 13. And it was Jesus. I thought, Jesus, he didn't even crack the top 10 of the most powerful leaders in human history. I found that so fascinating, considering how many billions of people declare him to be king and Lord over their lives. But anyways, this was not mine. Yeah. And then I'm scrolling through. I'm like, I gotta see who this person thinks is more powerful than Jesus. And I'm scrolling through these leaders, and I'm just shocked when I think about human history. Can I tell you about a few of them? And then show you something that God showed me? Blew my mind. So you need to at least, amuse me that it blows your mind, okay? Number 4 on this list was a king maybe you've heard about if you've been in church. Number 4, the 50 most powerful leaders ever. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar is Nebuchadnezzar II. In fact, I preached a sermon not long ago that was about Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar, the same guy. Number 4 on the list of most powerful leaders of all time. And here's what I know about King Nebuchadnezzar. He was one of the most ruthless kings. God actually used a pagan, ruthless king to execute judgment on the nation of Israel because they had turned away from God. How did this guy get into power? God used him. And he came in and they wiped out Jerusalem and took many of them captive back to Babylon. That is this King Nebuchadnezzar. By the way, something really cool about his story, and you can read Daniel chapter 4 on your own, but the last words that we see that he wrote, at least in the Bible, was him declaring how much he believed that there is only one God, and it is that God of Most High. That is one of the most incredible things that God did. I want to show you this, okay? I got to move on. Nebuchadnezzar. What happened is after King Nebuchadnezzar, there was another king that came to power that came in and conquered Babylon, and his name was Cyrus. He was known as Cyrus the Great. This was number 6 on the list of the 50 most powerful leaders. Cyrus, who led the Persian military, came and actually took over the Babylonian Empire. Now, Cyrus is also in the Bible. Here's what's interesting about Cyrus is that when he got into a place of power, God used Cyrus, this pagan king, to allow many of the Israelites to travel back to Jerusalem, and he even helped repay to build the temple in Jerusalem. I'm trying to show you something. These are pagan kings who got to power through doing ruthless things, and now the Persian Empire is growing to be the largest empire in the world. Cyrus, he was number 6. Guess who was number 7 on the list? Number 7 on the list was a guy named Alexander. Alexander of Macedon. You can look your history up. Alexander the Great. You know what Alexander did was he came in and wiped out the Persians. It's like the game of Risk if you step back and look at history. One empire after another. Alexander the Great. He came in and he made the largest known empire in that world of that time, the Macedonian Empire. Massive. You know what Alexander the Great is known for? He brought a unified language to all of the known world in that empire, and it was called Greek, Koine Greek. This, by the way, is the language that your New Testament was written in. Most of it was Greek. Why? Because of Alexander the Great. He came and he said, everywhere in my empire, we're going to make Greek the main language. So now everybody is speaking the same language. Now, while all this was happening, there was a republic in Italy, okay, the Roman Republic, that is starting to grow in power. And what the Romans started doing during all this time is they started constructing roads. They had engineers. They started building a network of roads until you get down to the 1st century BC, when all of a sudden the Romans overtook the entire known world of an empire. And there was a guy named Julius Caesar. By the way, he was number 11 on the list. He beat Jesus. Julius Caesar, some of you are like, oh, I know his story. You're right, you do know his story. Though he was not an emperor very long, what he did was he turned the Roman Republic into a Roman Empire, and he was their first emperor. And it was his nephew, I believe, Herod, that ended up becoming the king of the Judean countryside where Jesus was born into shortly thereafter. Why do I say all this? Because I'm looking through this list and I'm like, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Alexander, and Julius Caesar are ranked above Jesus. That's how the world sees it. These are wicked guys. They did evil things. They assassinated people, murdered people, killed people. How could you ever do that? And then all of a sudden I stepped back and I was, and God showed me something. That even when there are some of the wickedest kings that ever live in empires, you're like, how in the world could they be in control and God be okay with it? Then all of a sudden I realized something, that God was using those kings to set up a moment when he would send Jesus into the world where everybody spoke the same language and there was a network of roads to be able to take the message of Jesus and the gospel to the furthest parts of the reach. And so Jesus, after he was resurrected from the same death that this Roman Empire who crucified him. Oh, by the way, can you imagine that Jesus, he died under the hands of this awful, awful empire? And yet Jesus, and that God used it to do the greatest thing ever for human history. And Jesus looked at his disciples and he said, all authority is given to me, now go and make disciples. And God used them. And so here's what I want to say. No matter who gets elected, whenever, and who comes to power, here's what I know. God will use them for his glory and his purpose. Do you believe that today? Come on, y'all stand up to your feet today. I know gone a little long, but I just felt like we had to get this. What I'm trying to say to you today is this. It doesn't matter who sits in the Oval Office as long as Jesus is sitting on the throne in heaven. Can we not just recognize this truth today, guys? And I just want us today, as we close out the series, I hope it's challenged you. I hope it's caused you to think a little bit differently. And I just would love for us to kind of dedicate ourselves to living as though we live in the kingdom. Can we bow our heads? And would you bow your heads and just pray with me today? Father, I thank you, God, for just showing us that there's a better way. That you are sovereign over all. Listen, as we're praying, I don't know if maybe somebody right now in this moment that you would recognize that you have not been living under the authority of God. You have not surrendered your life to Jesus as the King of Kings. I just want to give you an opportunity right now in this moment that you can say, that's me. That today I'm just going to say yes to him. I realize that until I bow my knee before him, that he will never be Lord of my life. And I want to be a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. If that's you today, wherever you are online in this room, would you just say this? You say, Jesus, today I surrender my life to you. I believe you're the Lord of my life. Today I submit to you as an authority over my life. Every part of my life, I surrender it to you today. Forgive me, God. Save me, change me. God, I want to be a citizen in heaven. And so I receive you right now. Listen, as we're praying right now in this moment, I feel like this is a time for us as a church just to respond in our hearts, every single one of us. Father, I pray right now that we as a church, God, that we as a church could live as though we're going to bring heaven to earth. I pray, God, that right now that we would see ourselves, God, as citizens of heaven. That, God, we would demonstrate love above all else. That, God, we would submit to authority that you have placed over us. And by so doing, God, the world would take notice that these people, God, they're different. There's something about the love they have. There's something about this God that they follow. God, I pray right now for us as a church, your community, that, God, no matter who is in control, we know that you sit on the throne. God, we know that you're in control of everything. And so here we are surrendering our lives. God, we dedicate our lives to you. We say, God, use us. Come on, what did it look like for us to declare that today? God, you're the foundation for our lives. Come on, let's sing this.